to discuss with you the trauma and how to heal the people of Gaza, of what's happening and what's going on at the moment. I also know you're an influencer yourself on social media, and you speak a lot about the issue. So please talk us through what you think is happening at the moment and how could that be resolved in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm really honored to build and share community with you all. And my boss always tells me the work that you do is important, so do it well. And it's really beautiful and inspiring to see everybody here doing their work so well. My name's Katie Bogen. I am a doctoral student in clinical psychology at the University of Nebraska. I'm a trauma-focused therapist, and I work primarily with survivors of sexual trauma. And prior to beginning my PhD work, I worked for 5 years in violence prevention research at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, doing social norms-based interventions to prevent community violence. So all of my work, all of my clinical work, my research background is on violence prevention. And I am an American Jewish woman. I was raised by the son of a Holocaust survivor. My grandfather was liberated from a camp in 1945 with his sister Helen. And I was raised in a staunchly Zionist household. My family spoke of the sort of promise of the state of Israel the entire time I was growing up. And as a child, I bought into the fiction because I was taught nothing else. And when I started joining more progressive political organizing movements and getting to know leftist politics when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I went through the process as an American Jew of unlearning Zionism. And from sort of the social norms work that I have done on a research level and in a research space, and the anti-Zionism, sort of unlearning Zionism and becoming like developing a pro-Palestine politic work that I've done on an individual space, I feel very, very strongly about the efficacy of interventions to help people develop a more liberatory politic. So I'll introduce one of these potential avenues. And I'm happy to talk as well about my family background and the process of unlearning Zionism another time if folks are interested, or if there are questions. But one of the interventions that I got to work on for 5 years was a social norms intervention. And social norms theory is really about correcting people's misperceptions about what is normative. And it's built on two different theoretical grounds, the idea of pluralistic ignorance and false consensus. And I'll define these and give examples about how they apply to the Israeli perpetrated genocide. So pluralistic ignorance is the phenomenon by which individuals mistakenly perceive the attitudes and behaviors of their peers to be different from their own. This misperception usually occurs in the context of problem or risk behaviors. So what we would consider bad behaviors, things like accepting or perpetrating a genocide, are usually overestimated, and healthy or protective behaviors or good behaviors are underestimated. Pluralistic ignorance leads individuals to adjust their own behavior to align with the perceived norm, subsequently influencing the expression or rationalization of problem behaviors and inhibiting healthy protective behaviors like bystander intervention, like naming this as a genocide, like holding Israel accountable for human rights abuses. And the false consensus effect is the other side of that coin, where we have people, often perpetrators, falsely believing that other people share similar views and behaviors when in fact they do not. The false consensus effect can lead bullies, for example, to interpret lack of intervention against their violent behaviors as proof of implicit approval of their violence. And so how might this be functioning in sort of the news context and conversations about Israel and Palestine? So pluralistic ignorance may be functioning via people who support Palestine falsely believing that they are alone in their condemnation of Israel's violation of human rights, or falsely believing that other people in their communities or their social networks disagree. People who support Palestine may overestimate support for Israel and their own networks, underestimate shared support for Palestine because of the relative salience for us of positive and negative social cues. So if you say something in a group about how heartbroken you are over the plight of Palestinians and the children of Palestine who are undergoing bombardment and the abuse toward Palestinian women and the martyrdom of Palestinian men, and one person makes a disgusted face and everyone else in the circle is nodding, you might internalize that look of disgust more than you recognize the however many other people are agreeing with you. And on the other hand, the false consensus effect may work in this context of, Israelis, American Jews, corporations and businesses that are vested in Israel, falsely believing that their peers, their colleagues, their collaborators agree with their support of Israeli aggression and human rights abuses against Palestine, especially if these peers, colleagues, collaborators, etc., don't intervene against their behavior. We already know that this is happening in the global political community. So one possible method for intervention and for garnering more support for Palestine is a norms correction campaign. If we ask a large group of people very direct questions such as, do you support targeting civilians in the context of land disputes? Or do you agree that governments should be able to target and bomb refugee camps during times of conflict? We may find that respondents to those surveys, even Israeli respondents, even Jewish respondents, could be no. That's not excusable. As long as we don't name Israel and Palestine as actors, we might find that they don't perceive that as excusable. And then we can publicize that corrected perception of, 85 to 95% of this group of Israelis or this group of American Jews actually believe that this is not excusable. And that gives people more latitude to begin intervening as bystanders. And I think that that is one of the reasons that my social media garnered such shocking traction after October 7th, despite the fact that I am not saying anything on my social media that Palestinian activists, Palestinian women and feminists haven't been saying for 75 years. I'm not contributing anything new necessarily. I am aware that I'm a mouthpiece here. I am magnifying these perspectives that have already existed for generations, but it caught such traction and people paid such attention because I'm the embodiment of a violation of a social norm. People don't expect full-throated support for Palestine to come from a, young queer American Jew. They certainly don't expect it to come from the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor and someone who has sort of survival of Nazi crap in her bloodline, right? And so because this was a violation of social norms, people all of a sudden paid attention. And now I have latitude to reach 250,000 people that I have no right to these people's attention. There's nothing that sets me apart from Palestinian activists besides the fact that I am surprising. So there's been this sort of internal debate among activist spaces that I've observed about taking up space and whose voices are centered and who are we speaking sort of with, for, and to. And I do think when we're engaging in corrective campaigning, social norms campaigning, my research in trauma and violence prevention tells me you can target the victims of violence as much as you want with sort of risk reduction and self-protection campaigns. And that's not going to do the work. Those are the people you provide resources for once the violence has been stemmed, and in order to sort of keep them well during the violence. But the people that you target with the corrective campaigning are the perpetrators, the would-be perpetrators. So if we're going to conduct any kind of social norms correction, it should be directed toward people who are actively in the process of unlearning Zionism and can direct resources away from the Zionist entity, away from the state of Israel, away from Israeli businesses, politicians, arms manufacturers, etc. And in terms of people to center, though I'm kind of an exception to this rule, Palestinian voices should, of course, be front and center. I worry about this debate as detracting from a possible message and creating sort of sectarianism in that we should all be speaking as loudly as possible about Israel's violation of human rights abuses, about the violence that they are enacting against Palestinian civilians, as loudly as possible, for as long as possible, for the foreseeable future, sort of regardless of our held identities. And in doing that, we will also be correcting the social norms about who cares about this topic. Because if the Western world tells itself the only people who care about Palestinians experiencing violence are Palestinians, we're going to have a much harder time changing hearts and minds, unfortunately, because white supremacy is still at work within these systems that we're trying to change. So I will leave you, I guess, with that. If I had more time, I would sort of
I think
address
it's
a breadth of
extremely
topics, but
interesting, but
yeah,
as
I
a
think,
Palestinian, second generation Palestinian, I can tell you, you really underestimated your effect. You're not just the mouthpiece, but for us, especially in the beginning, the isolation that we felt, it was so heartwarming to see there's so many colors and there's so many faces and there's so much support because as you said you might tend to see that one face and you think oh the whole world is against us but then it is important to know that we're not really that isolated and there is a populist sort of support even if it's not necessarily reflected.
I think her contribution is like that, the contribution of many American Jews who are coming and seeing the light and recognizing the humanity uh, and the suffering of the Palestinian people. And I think this is really amazing and incredible that our narrative and our story is a very basic story. Our story is a very human story. And despite the demonization and the dehumanization of the Palestinian people throughout American media and Western media in general, and despite, I mean, the wall-to-wall 24/7 pro occupation media coverage, you're still seeing people who I think really need to be recognized, like Katherine and many of her peers, who are able to see through the thick of that propaganda that tries to demonize and dehumanize the Palestinians. So this is really an incredible thing. That if there is anything positive that would come out of the killing of 20,000 Palestinians, and I don't see anything positive can come out of it. If there is one thing that we can see that is so many people are recognizing what a criminal state the state of Israel is. I have a good friend of mine, Miko Beled, who wrote the book The Son of the General, who's saying, why are you calling for ceasefire? You should be calling for the dismantling of the apartheid regime that is called Israel. And I think these calls are being heard loud and clear. And once again, I want to thank Katherine for hopping on the call last minute. I mean, this is good.
thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much, Khalid, for your input. I am sorry I'm jumping into this, but it's just that I'm going to give you the floor, Catherine, but we also have two more questions. But please, I ask everyone to please be brief because we're running out of time. Catherine, is there anything you want to say to
Yeah,
Khalid?
yeah, absolutely. I think when we talk about sort of this being a very human story, the parallels to Jewish history and Jewish resistance are so stark, and that I think is evidence that can be used against, anti-Zionism as anti-Semitic, because when people imagine armed Palestinian resistance against their occupiers, I don't understand how we're not immediately seeing the parallel of armed resistance against Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto. That was my first thought when I learned about the history of sort of Palestinian resistance of the occupation as well. My grandfather did that. His sisters did that. This is sort of how our movement was born and how our people were made possible. So I would urge folks, if they feel comfortable using that parallel, this is a Jewish woman endorsing your use of that parallel. Please, please use the Warsaw Ghetto.